It began with an ordinary return home. The garage door lifted slowly, revealing a scene that would unravel a life and fracture a community. David Cam, a former Indiana state trooper, had just arrived at his suburban residence after a recreational basketball game with friends. What he expected was the routine of a quiet evening. What he found was silence, and something far more sinister. Inside the garage sat the family's Ford Bronco. The headlights were off, the engine quiet. But something felt wrong. The doors weren't fully closed, the interior light was still on, and no one was there to greet him. Then he saw her. Kimberly Cam, David's wife, lay on the cold concrete floor beside the vehicle. Blood pooled beneath her head. She wasn't moving. Near her, the bodies of their two young children, Bradley, age 7, and Jill, age 5, were still buckled into their booster seats. Their faces were pale, their limbs motionless. The interior of the car was streaked with blood. Cam dropped to his knees. 911 was called immediately. His voice was uneven but composed. The dispatcher asked questions. Cam answered. "They're dead," he said. "I need help." There was no sound of panic, only blunt, dry statements. When the first responders arrived, they secured the scene. It was clear from the beginning there would be no saving this family. Kimberly had been shot once in the head. Bradley had suffered a gunshot wound to the chest. Jill, too, had been shot at close range. The brutality of the act was unmistakable, yet the setting remained eerily undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no valuables were missing. Kimberly's purse, still containing cash and credit cards, was in the front seat. The garage door had not been damaged. The rest of the house appeared untouched. There were no broken windows, no signs of a robbery or chaotic flight. What had occurred here was precise, deliberate, and deeply personal. Investigators began their work at once. They mapped the garage, took photographs of every angle, collected trace evidence, and cataloged the positions of the bodies. The crime scene appeared contained. There were no bloody footprints leading in or out, no shell casings in unexpected places, and no weapons recovered. David Cam, now a widower and the sole surviving member of his family, was taken in for questioning, not as a suspect, but as a witness, at least initially. Cam told detectives he had left the house earlier that evening to play basketball at a local church gymnasium. He had been there for about 2 hours, he said, and several people could confirm it. He had returned home to find the garage in its current state. He claimed not to have touched the bodies beyond trying to check for pulses and opening the vehicle door to reach his children. The timeline seemed plausible at first glance, but as the details began to emerge, inconsistencies crept in. One investigator noted faint blood spatter on the front of Cam's t-shirt. It was a small detail, nearly invisible without close inspection, but one that would become pivotal. According to blood pattern analysis, the fine droplets suggested high-velocity impact, the type that occurs when a bullet strikes at close range. It was a finding that challenged Cam's narrative. If he hadn't been present during the shootings, how had this pattern gotten on his clothing? The question hung in the air, quietly, ominously. Autopsies confirmed the order and method of death. Kimberly had likely been the first to die. She had a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. The lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been caught by surprise. Bradley's wound was to the chest. He may have witnessed his mother's death before his own. Jill had been shot while still strapped into her seat, a detail that would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. The murders were efficient, executed with calm calculation, a crime of emotion, but with surgical detachment. Word spread quickly. A triple homicide in a quiet Indiana neighborhood made headlines across the state. The press began digging into Cam's background. At first, the narrative was sympathetic, a father who had lost everything, but skepticism began to build. Reporters unearthed that he had recently left the state police under murky circumstances. Rumors of extramarital affairs surfaced. It painted a picture that didn't match the idyllic family photos now circulating on news channels. Cam's alibi, playing basketball, was tested. The men he played with vouched for his presence, but none could account for his every minute. There was a gap, a window of opportunity, and in that gap, suspicion found room to grow. Detectives began reconstructing the night in granular detail. Surveillance footage from nearby streets showed no suspicious vehicles, no unknown individuals, no break-ins reported in the neighborhood. The silence of the crime scene became its loudest clue. Whoever had done this was familiar with the house, the family, and how to avoid detection. The investigation turned inward. Police began to re-interview David Cam. Not because they had definitive proof of his guilt, but because he was, by elimination, the only known person who could have orchestrated such a clean, controlled execution without leaving a trace. A forensic team examined the garage again, this time under UV light and with chemical reagents. A single footprint, bloody partial, was discovered near the driver's side door. It didn't match Cam, but the tread was indistinct, possibly from a worn athletic shoe. It was logged, but at that point meant little without a match. The first chapter of this investigation closed not with answers, but with the chilling clarity of the crime's precision. Someone had waited. Someone had known the exact moment to strike, and the deeper the authorities looked, the more they began to question whether the father who claimed to have lost everything might, in fact, be the one who had taken it all. The photographs on the mantel painted a picture of American stability. David and Kimberly standing beside their two children, Bradley and Jill, on a warm summer day. Matching smiles, coordinated outfits, the kind of staged happiness expected from family portraits. At first glance, it was a life enviable by most standards. A well-kept home in southern Indiana, a former police officer husband with community ties, and two children who, by all accounts, were bright, curious, and deeply loved. But when 3 lives are taken in a single act of violence, the surface begins to fracture. Investigators know that behind the polished veneer of the perfect family, there often lie small, unnoticed cracks. Cracks that, under the right pressure, become fault lines. David Cam's background was complex. He had served for over a decade with the Indiana State Police. His record was commendable, though not without blemish. He left the force a few years prior to the murders under circumstances that were never publicly disclosed in full, but the departure raised eyebrows among those who had worked closest to him. Some former colleagues described him as competent and driven, others as emotionally distant and difficult to read. He was not universally liked, nor universally distrusted. He was in many ways an enigma to his peers. Kimberly Cam, by contrast, was widely known as kind, grounded, and nurturing. She was active in her church community, volunteered at her children's school, and maintained close ties with her family. She was described as the kind of person who made others feel immediately welcome. Her life seemed rooted in routine, school drop-offs, grocery trips, family dinners. Yet even those closest to her would later admit that in the months leading up to the murders, something had shifted. She had grown quieter, distracted, some said. Her sister would later recall a conversation in which Kimberly expressed vague unease, no concrete threats, no accusations, just a growing sense that something wasn't right. These subtle cues rarely raise alarms in the moment. Only in retrospect do they take on ominous meaning. As investigators peeled back the layers of the family's life, one unavoidable truth emerged. The Cams had been under pressure, not financially destitute, but strained. David had entered the world of real estate after leaving law enforcement, and the market had not been kind. Kimberly had picked up part-time work to supplement their income. There were bills, mortgage payments, and a growing gap between appearances and reality. Marital issues, once whispered about among close circles, came into clearer focus. There were rumors of infidelity on David's part. Text messages discovered during the investigation suggested flirtations with multiple women. One name surfaced repeatedly, a woman David had reportedly seen over the course of several months. Kimberly, it seemed, had found out. Whether the marriage was on the brink of collapse or undergoing a rough patch remained a subject of speculation, but the tension was real. Still, none of this amounted to motive. People fight, couples drift apart, financial stress is common. These facts alone do not predict violence, and yet, the context matters. The psychological profile of the family dynamic began to take shape. Kimberly was protective of her children, emotionally expressive, known for documenting their milestones meticulously. Bradley was a straight-A student who had recently joined a youth baseball league. Jill had started kindergarten that fall, known for her loud laugh and love of drawing. Their lives were integrated into the community, into routines that left behind traces, school events, birthday parties, church potlucks. This was not a family that lived in isolation, which made the crime all the more chilling. It hadn't occurred in the middle of nowhere. It happened in a neighborhood, on a quiet residential street, and no one heard anything. No screams, no alarms, just the echo of a garage door opening to reveal the unimaginable. Investigators began to ask harder questions. If this were a crime of passion, where was the chaos? If it were a home invasion, Why wasn't anything stolen? If it were random, how had the perpetrator known when the victims would be vulnerable? The more the case was examined, the clearer it became. This was not an opportunistic crime. It was too clean, too fast, too intimate. In interviews with friends and extended family, a pattern of small, disconnected details began to emerge. Kimberly had spoken vaguely about needing to make some decisions. She had taken out a small life insurance policy through her part-time employer. She had recently changed the password to her personal email. Again, no single act seemed extraordinary, but together, they told a story of a woman preparing for something or someone. David Cam maintained that his marriage was intact, that despite the typical ups and downs, he and Kimberly were stable. He acknowledged arguments, but denied violence or abuse. To law enforcement, his affect was subdued. He did not cry in the early interviews. He did not ask many questions about the status of the case. Some would later interpret this as coldness, others as shock. A forensic psychologist consulted by the prosecution would later remark, "Grief doesn't have a uniform. People respond in ways that make sense to them, not to us. But what we look for are patterns. Does the behavior align with the facts?" As the investigation deepened, the focus shifted from simply reconstructing the events of that night to understanding the forces that may have led up to it. In many cases, the motive is the missing puzzle piece, the answer that makes all the other fragments fall into place. But here, there were too many fragments and no picture yet to be seen. The community that once held candlelight vigils and prayed for justice now began to whisper. Some found it unthinkable that David could be responsible. Others were less sure. The contradictions in his demeanor, the vague timeline of his evening, and the emerging evidence on his clothing seeded doubt. Still, there were no eyewitnesses, no security footage showing a perpetrator, no weapon recovered. The case, though intensely scrutinized, remained without resolution. But within law enforcement, a quiet consensus had started to form. David Cam was no longer just a grieving husband. He was becoming a person of interest. And as the scope of the investigation expanded, so too did the sense that this case was not only about what had happened in that garage, but about what had been happening inside the Cam family for much longer. When violence takes place in silence, when 3 lives are extinguished without a scream, without shattered glass or splintered doors, forensic science becomes the loudest voice in the room. In the case of the Cam family murders, that voice began to speak not through eyewitness accounts or confessions, but through microscopic patterns, chemical traces, and a single white t-shirt. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, the physical scene offered remarkably little in the way of overt chaos. The garage remained structurally undisturbed. The home itself, just a few steps away, showed no signs of a struggle. There were no dragged footprints or scattered possessions, no overturned furniture, no shattered vases or broken windows. Everything was in place, except for the lives that had been violently removed from it. For the investigators, this absence of disorder was itself a clue. Whoever committed this crime had done so efficiently, perhaps even methodically. It didn't appear to be a spontaneous act of rage, nor did it suggest the impulsiveness of a burglary gone wrong. This was something else, something colder. But even the most calculated crime cannot escape science. The crime scene technicians approached the space with the quiet intensity that comes from years of examining places where life has been abruptly ended. They worked slowly, deliberately, methodically documenting every surface. High-resolution photographs were taken, swabs collected, luminol applied in controlled bursts. What couldn't be seen with the naked eye, they sought to reveal with light, chemicals, and time. Inside the vehicle, the pattern of blood confirmed what the autopsy would later prove. The children had been shot while seated in the rear of the SUV. There were no defensive wounds on either child, no evidence they had tried to flee or resist. One had been shot through the chest, the other through the mouth. Both had died instantly. The angles suggested close-range shots, likely fired from outside the vehicle, but through the open door. Kimberly, meanwhile, had been shot once in the back of the head. The entry wound and trajectory indicated she had been standing or kneeling at the time, and likely did not see the shot coming. There were no signs she had moved after the shooting. The blood pooling beneath her was consistent with a body falling immediately and not being dragged. Then came the clothing. David Cam, when initially interviewed, turned over the clothing he had worn that night: basketball shorts, athletic shoes, and a white t-shirt. On that shirt, forensic analysts found several small, barely visible stains. At first, they seemed insignificant, but under microscopic analysis, the shape and dispersal pattern of those stains told a different story. These were not large smears or pools, nothing that would come from a panicked embrace or failed attempt at resuscitation. Instead, the shirt bore a handful of tiny droplets, no more than pinpricks, arrayed in a fine mist across the front chest area. This type of blood spatter, often categorized as high-velocity impact spatter, is most commonly associated with gunshots. The force generated when a bullet tears through flesh at close range creates a distinctive spray, a mist so fine that it can only be seen through close analysis. And this mist, experts explained, typically settles on the shooter. The presence of that pattern on David Cam's shirt was significant. It challenged his version of events. He had claimed he found the bodies, checked for signs of life, and called for help. He hadn't claimed to handle the bodies extensively. He hadn't claimed to be near them at the moment of death. So how, the investigators asked, had this particular blood pattern found its way onto his shirt? To answer that question, the state brought in blood spatter experts, including a crime scene reconstructionist with decades of experience in analyzing the behavior of blood at violent crime scenes. He studied the pattern, the angle, the size of each droplet. His conclusion was direct and damning. The shirt had to have been worn by someone present at the time. At least one of the victims was shot. Defense experts would later challenge the methodology. They argued that the science of blood spatter interpretation is far from exact. Variables, distance, angle, weapon caliber, environmental conditions could all influence the findings. But in the early stages of the investigation, this piece of evidence became a cornerstone of the prosecution's emerging theory. Further analysis introduced more questions. The blood on David's shirt was matched through DNA testing to his daughter Jill, but Jill had been shot inside the vehicle. David had told officers he never entered the SUV, only opened the door. So again, how did the spray reach him? One theory suggested a close-range shooting with David standing near the open door, something that would only make sense if he had fired the weapon. There was no blood on the rest of his clothing, no heavy transfer patterns, no signs he had held or cradled Jill after the fact. It was only the mist, the invisible evidence that suggested presence at the critical moment. Outside the garage, more tests were underway. Investigators examined the floor, the walls, the underside of the garage door. UV light revealed no significant secondary transfer, no signs of someone stepping through blood and then walking away. This further supported the idea that the killer had acted with control, had avoided contamination, and had left little behind. No fingerprints were found on the vehicle doors beyond those belonging to the family. No gloves were recovered. The murder weapon had not been located, but it was clear that whoever pulled the trigger had done so quickly, possibly in less than a minute. One detail began to haunt detectives. The bodies of the children were untouched. They were still buckled into their seats. Jill's arms had remained resting on her lap. Bradley's head had tilted slightly forward. It was as if they had not even flinched, either unaware of what was happening or paralyzed by fear. This realization struck a deeply human nerve. Investigators, some of them fathers themselves, began to internalize the horror of what had been done. The mechanical facts, angles, calibers, distances gave way briefly to grief, but the job had to continue. They returned to the shirt, to the mist. If David had been nowhere near his daughter when she was shot, how had her blood reached him? If he had arrived after the fact, why was there no visible blood on his hands, shoes, or shorts? Why only this subtle, almost imperceptible stain across his chest? Each question pulled the case closer to a singular possibility. Not proof, but possibility. By this stage, prosecutors were beginning to take notice. With no other suspects, no signs of a break-in, and a forensic clue that suggested proximity to the moment of death, a case was slowly forming, not yet airtight, but increasingly focused. Still, there were details that didn't fit. A bloody shoe print near the driver's side door of the SUV had been recovered, but did not match any of David's footwear. No one could identify its origin. The garage lacked security cameras, and neighbors hadn't seen or heard anything. Without a murder weapon, without eyewitnesses, the case would need to rely heavily on interpretation, of blood, of behavior, of motive. And interpretation in the justice system walks a fine line between science and speculation. As law enforcement continued their investigation, the Cam case began to divide not just investigators, but communities. Those who knew David personally struggled to believe he could be capable of such violence. Others, more detached, saw in the evidence a story of calculation disguised as tragedy. Forensic science had given the case momentum, but momentum is not the same as certainty. The shirt, the mist, the droplets, they pointed but did not yet prove. And so the search continued. No one expects a homicide investigation to remain confined to a garage. It may begin at the scene of the crime, but it rarely ends there. As investigators stood before the blood-spattered interior of the Cam family SUV, surrounded by neatly parked lawn equipment and the banal silence of a suburban Indiana neighborhood, they knew the truth would not be found only in physical evidence. It would live elsewhere, buried in routines, relationships, resentments, and the complex fabric of a family unraveling behind closed doors. To understand the who and why, law enforcement had to look beyond the forensics and into the deeper emotional and psychological terrain of David and Kimberly Cam's marriage. They returned to the people who knew the couple best, not just friends, but relatives, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who might offer even the faintest insight into what lay beneath the surface of their seemingly stable life. At church functions and community events, David and Kimberly had appeared like any other middle-class couple. But those closest to them described an emotional distance that had slowly taken hold in the years before the murders. Kimberly had grown more guarded, more introspective, according to her sister. She had stopped talking openly about David. Her once detailed stories about their family life had become sparse, abstract. When asked about her marriage, she would smile, change the subject, or simply nod and offer vague assurances that everything was okay. Friends reported a more visible shift. Kimberly had stopped attending social outings where David would be present. She began arriving at gatherings with the children alone. She seemed tired, distracted, and at times uneasy. One friend recalled Kimberly once saying, in a moment of vulnerability, "I just don't know who I'm married to anymore." It was not an accusation. It was a confession of fatigue and fear. Investigators learned that Kimberly had started keeping a private journal. In it, she documented subtle suspicions. David staying out later than usual, strange phone numbers appearing on their shared phone bill, and her unease when he received text messages he wouldn't explain. While the journal didn't detail any overt abuse or threats, it painted a portrait of a woman who felt herself slowly pushed to the margins of her own marriage. She was searching for clarity, not just about David's actions, but about her own future. Kimberly's financial activity had also changed in the months prior to her death. She'd begun moving small amounts of money into a separate account, amounts too minor to trigger notice, but large enough to suggest preparation. She had also inquired with a divorce attorney in a neighboring county. The consultation was informal, exploratory. She hadn't filed any paperwork, but it revealed intent, or at least serious consideration. These discoveries formed the backbone of a developing narrative, one that prosecutors would later use to frame motive. But motive is never that simple. It isn't enough to say that someone had marital problems. Millions do. It isn't enough to point to financial tension. That, too, is a common denominator. What mattered was whether the emotional erosion of the Cam marriage could be linked to the extreme violence that followed. As the investigation deepened, another layer of David Cam's life emerged, one he had tried to keep compartmentalized. During his time as a state trooper, David had cultivated a reputation for being charismatic, confident, and some claimed flirtatious to the point of recklessness. Several women came forward to describe inappropriate relationships, some of which allegedly occurred while David was still married. One woman, who had worked briefly with him on a community outreach project, described him as charming but calculating. Another said he had pursued her persistently even after learning she was married. While no criminal misconduct had been officially documented, the stories painted a picture of a man with a compartmentalized moral code, publicly committed to order and justice, privately drawn to secrecy and control. The more investigators peeled back, the more they encountered these inconsistencies. David had resigned from the Indiana State Police under what were officially termed personal reasons, but internal memos hinted at an undisclosed professional breach. Though sealed at the time, law enforcement insiders indicated that the departure had been sudden, and that the department had no intention of inviting him back. Was this the profile of a man capable of executing his family? It remained an open question, but prosecutors began assembling a circumstantial case that hinged not on brutality, but on subtlety. They argued that David Cam was not a man who snapped. He was a man who planned, a man who, when threatened with exposure, financial, emotional, or reputational, chose to act in the way that preserved his image at the greatest cost. In this narrative, Kimberly's decision to separate, or at least confront David, had become a threat. Her knowledge of his extramarital activity, combined with the emotional distance that had grown between them, positioned her not just as a spouse, but as someone who held leverage over his carefully managed persona. If she left, if she spoke out, if she pursued legal action, the world would see a different David Cam, a less polished one. Still, speculation was not evidence, and the law required more than pattern and theory. It required facts that could withstand cross-examination. That's where the digital trail entered the frame. Kimberly's phone records showed text messages sent to a friend just days before her death. In them, she expressed concerns that someone had been watching her. She didn't name David, but she said she felt paranoid and that something didn't feel right. She wondered whether she was overreacting, but added, "It's like there's something behind his eyes that I've never seen before." That statement would later be read aloud in court. But at the time of the investigation, it was a red flag. One more signal that what had happened in that garage was not isolated, but the conclusion of a long buildup. A culmination of conflict, resentment, betrayal, and possibly fear. Public perception began to shift. In the days following the funeral, the town had rallied behind David. Vigils were held, ribbons were tied to lampposts. But as the investigation began leaking into public discourse, that unity fractured. People wanted answers, and in the absence of definitive proof, suspicion became the currency of conversation. Neighbors who once defended David grew silent. Former colleagues declined interviews. The local media, initially cautious, began framing headlines around the mystery, not just of who could have done this, but what was happening inside a marriage that ended in a triple homicide. Investigators, though careful not to assume guilt, recognized the value of understanding the emotional architecture of a crime. Forensic evidence told them when and how, but motive required human context: fear, betrayal, desperation. Those could not be measured in blood patterns or shell casings. They had to be found in the fragments of daily life. And so, every phone call, every calendar entry, every credit card receipt became a piece of a psychological puzzle, one that, when assembled, suggested that the cracks beneath the Cam family's image were not just cosmetic, they were structural, and they had been widening for some time. There comes a point in nearly every major criminal investigation when the weight of public scrutiny collides with the burden of prosecutorial judgment. The Cam case had reached that threshold. Weeks had passed since the murders. 3 caskets had been lowered into the ground. The grief had faded from news headlines, replaced by suspicion. A community that once lit candles now whispered theories. The town wanted justice. The justice system, however, needed evidence. Prosecutors were aware that the case was not ready in the traditional sense. They had no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no clear-cut confession, and no indisputable forensic smoking gun. But what they did have, what they had carefully assembled over hundreds of hours, was a mosaic of implications. Hints, patterns, choices made under pressure, reactions under observation, and perhaps most critically, the blood spatter evidence, which they believed placed David Cam at the scene in a moment when he should not have been. Prosecutors chose to act. The decision to arrest David Cam was not made lightly. It followed a series of internal consultations, peer reviews of the forensic findings, and a growing belief that allowing him to remain free would undermine public confidence in the justice system. For some, it was a necessary escalation. For others within the legal community, it felt premature. When the arrest warrant was executed, it shocked many in the community. Despite the rumors, despite the shifting public tone, David still had vocal supporters, friends, family members, even former colleagues, who could not reconcile the man they knew with the crime now pinned to his name. The charges were severe, 3 counts of murder, each carrying the weight of capital consequences. The prosecution announced their case with careful language, acknowledging its complexity, but expressing confidence that the evidence would support conviction. To the outside world, this was a moment of resolution. But for those familiar with the inner workings of high-stakes criminal trials, it was only the beginning of a protracted and uncertain battle. Behind closed doors, the prosecution team worked relentlessly to refine their case. They reviewed every forensic report, reevaluated every phone record, and mapped out the timeline of the night down to the minute. What emerged was a narrative built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. It was not direct, but it was layered, each piece carefully chosen to cast doubt on David's innocence and highlight inconsistencies in his version of events. The timeline would become their anchor. According to cell phone records, David had left for his basketball game early in the evening. Multiple people confirmed his presence at the gym, but the exact duration of his stay was murky. Some witnesses recalled him arriving late. Others could not account for his whereabouts during a short window of time, around the midpoint of the game. It was during this ambiguous span, no more than 20 minutes perhaps, that prosecutors believed he had left the gym, driven home, committed the murders, and returned without raising alarm. Critics would later call this theory implausible, too tight, too mechanical, but prosecutors argued that the murders themselves had been carried out with surgical precision. They didn't need an hour, they didn't need a mess, they just needed opportunity and intent. Intent, however, cannot be extracted from crime scene photos. It must be inferred. Prosecutors pointed to the blood spatter. They argued that David's shirt placed him in the trajectory of a fatal gunshot, close enough to be sprayed with the fine mist of arterial spray that only occurs when a bullet tears through human tissue. It was, they said, not the kind of evidence someone would acquire after the fact. It was not the result of kneeling by a body. It was the result of being there, when the trigger was pulled. To bolster this, they brought in expert witnesses, bloodstain pattern analysts, crime scene reconstructionists, professionals with impressive credentials who explained in clinical detail how droplets behave, how velocity alters trajectory, how even a fraction of a second can create a unique forensic signature. The jurors, they hoped, would trust the science, even if the science could not speak definitively. Yet every element of the prosecution's case had a counterweight. The defense was quick to point out the dangers of relying too heavily on interpretive science. Blood spatter analysis, they argued, was not an exact discipline. It relied on human judgment, on assumptions about angles and distances that could not be perfectly replicated. They warned against conviction by suggestion, reminding the court that forensic consensus is not the same as proof beyond reasonable doubt. But beyond the science, prosecutors leaned into motive. They painted a portrait of a man under immense pressure, a failing marriage, a trail of extramarital affairs, mounting financial difficulties, a career that had once promised prestige now reduced to unstable freelance income. David Cam, they claimed, stood at a precipice. And Kimberly, whether she realized it or not, had become the tipping point. She had been preparing to leave. She had seen an attorney. She had documented concerns in a private journal. She had told friends that David had changed, that she no longer felt safe. It was all circumstantial. But in the courtroom, circumstance can be persuasive. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints besides those of family members, no missing items. The children were killed in their seats. Kimberly was executed at close range. This was not the signature of an outsider. It was the signature of someone who knew the house, knew the routine, and could carry out violence without hesitation. Still, prosecutors faced challenges. The foreign shoe print in the garage remained unexplained. It did not match David or any of his known shoes. It was a partial imprint, lacking in detail. But its presence suggested that someone else had been in that space, someone yet to be identified. The prosecution argued it was irrelevant, possibly transferred from an old stain or left by a first responder. The defense saw it differently. The murder weapon was never found. No gun was recovered from the home, the vehicles, or any of David's known possessions. Prosecutors believed he had disposed of it effectively, possibly with help. But the absence of the weapon left a void, one that jurors would be asked to bridge through inference rather than fact. The case moved slowly toward trial. Pre-trial hearings were filled with motions and counter-motions, requests for suppression, debates over admissibility. The defense sought to exclude the blood spatter evidence, calling it unreliable. The prosecution fought to keep it in, calling it foundational. Meanwhile, public opinion hardened. The early sympathy for David eroded. His silence, once seen as dignified restraint, began to appear cold. His refusal to speak publicly was interpreted by some as guilt. The media, always hungry for narrative, leaned into the idea of the double life, the former cop with a dark side. What was lost in all this was nuance. David Cam was not a proven killer. He had not been convicted. But the machinery of prosecution was already turning, and once it begins, it rarely slows. The trial date was set. The courthouse would soon become a stage, and the story that unfolded would be told not just through evidence, but through performance. each side presenting their version of reality, hoping to sway 12 jurors toward belief. And in that space between belief and certainty, justice would be decided. A courtroom is more than a setting for facts. It is a space where narrative and perception intersect, where truth often competes with presentation, and where the tone of a voice or the flicker of a glance can sway hearts and minds just as strongly as science or logic. In the case of David Camm, the first trial was not merely about determining guilt or innocence. It was about telling a story compelling enough to outweigh the gaps, the contradictions, and the lingering shadows that the evidence could not fully dispel. The trial began under a cloud of public scrutiny. Media coverage had elevated the case to statewide infamy, saturating headlines and igniting debate across Indiana. Local news anchors dissected every detail, court filings were poured over on nightly broadcasts, and tabloid-style speculation blurred with legal commentary. The triple murder of a mother and two children in their own home had all the ingredients to fuel fascination and outrage. Security was tightened around the courthouse. Reporters lined the entrance, cameras rolling as David Camm arrived in a suit and tie, flanked by his attorneys. His expression was flat, unreadable. No smiles, no visible emotion. It was a demeanor that, to some, reflected composure. To others, it seemed like calculated detachment. Inside the courtroom, the stakes became immediately apparent. Prosecutors opened their case with a quiet but methodical approach. They did not begin with blood or trauma photos, nor with graphic autopsy reports. Instead, they introduced Kimberly, Bradley, and Jill Camm through family photos, vacation snapshots, birthday parties, moments frozen in time. The strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. Humanize the victims before delving into the science. Only after this emotional groundwork had been laid did the prosecution begin to build its factual structure. They called forensic analysts, crime scene technicians, and blood pattern experts to the stand. The central theme was clear. David Camm's t-shirt had betrayed him. That speckled mist of blood, invisible to the naked eye, was presented as near irrefutable evidence that he had stood near his daughter at the moment she was shot. The analysts described the science with precision. They explained how high-velocity impact spatter is generated, how droplets are dispersed in predictable patterns, and how contamination was ruled out by proper chain-of-custody protocols. Graphs and photos were shown to the jury. The shirt itself was displayed as an exhibit under clear plastic lit just right to show the faint stains that had become the linchpin of the case. But the prosecution didn't rely on forensics alone. They introduced evidence of David's alleged affairs, framed not as moral failings but as indicators of instability and selfishness. They highlighted Kimberly's journal entries, her financial planning, her visit to a divorce attorney. They painted a picture of a man backed into a corner, a husband with a motive, an opportunity, and, they argued, a willingness to erase the future that threatened his control. The jury sat silent as David's personal life was dissected with clinical thoroughness. Every text message, every bank statement, every inconsistent statement he had made during early police interviews. The prosecution meticulously pointed to inconsistencies, not just what he said, but how he said it. His lack of visible grief, his demeanor during questioning, the words he didn't use. Still, the defense pushed back with vigor. They opened their case by reminding the jury of the presumption of innocence, of the state's burden to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and of the dangers of allowing emotion to override evidence. Their strategy was to highlight the fragility of the prosecution's timeline, the unreliability of bloodstain interpretation, and the presence of an unidentified bloody footprint at the scene, an element the prosecution had largely minimized. The defense also leaned on character witnesses. Former colleagues, friends, and neighbors testified to David's devotion as a father, his dedication to coaching youth sports, his presence at community events. They argued that he had no history of violence, no record of aggression, no prior indications that he was capable of the horror now attributed to him. One of the most pivotal moments came when the defense called its own blood pattern analyst. This expert criticized the methodology of the state's analysts, arguing that the stains on David's shirt could have been caused by secondary transfer, perhaps when opening the SUV door or brushing against a bloodied surface. He testified that the science was far from conclusive and that interpretation varied between experts. Then came the matter of time. The defense walked the jury through a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the evening. They presented cell phone pings, witness statements, and traffic estimations to argue that David could not have committed the murders and returned to his basketball game in the window, prosecutors proposed. The margins were too narrow, the logistics too implausible, the risk too high. But trials are rarely decided on logic alone. Jurors are human. They absorb testimony through the filters of their own life experiences, biases, and emotional responses. And in this case, the emotional gravity of the crime was overwhelming. Two innocent children, a mother executed in her own garage. The notion that the man accused was a father, a husband, and a former law enforcement officer only made the betrayal feel more grotesque, if true. The trial stretched over weeks. Each day brought new evidence, new expert opinions, new speculation. The media spun daily recaps, shaping public perception in real time. Inside the courtroom, the weight of the proceedings began to show. Jurors grew visibly fatigued. Reporters noted moments when David appeared to shake slightly while seated at the defense table. Others observed the family members of both sides, divided, weary, and worn down by the relentless tide of testimony. In closing arguments, the prosecution reiterated their central thesis. This was not a crime of passion or a random act. It was a controlled execution carried out by someone who had everything to lose. They urged the jury to trust the evidence, to follow the science, and to reject the illusion that David Cam had simply stumbled upon the bodies of his family. The defense, in turn, implored jurors to remember what was not presented: the missing weapon, the unexplained footprint, the possibility of another perpetrator. They warned against turning suspicion into certainty and cautioned that reasonable doubt by law must result in acquittal. Deliberations began. For days, the jury debated. They requested to review evidence. They asked for transcripts of key testimonies. The courthouse remained on edge as reporters and families waited for a verdict that would echo far beyond the confines of that courtroom. When the jury returned, the room fell into a silence so complete it seemed to suspend time. Guilty. 3 counts of murder. The reaction was immediate. Kimberly's family wept in relief. David's supporters sat in stunned disbelief. David himself did not speak. His eyes remained locked forward as the judge thanked the jury for their service. The first trial had ended. But for David Cam and for those who still believed in his innocence, it was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a longer, darker fight. Conviction does not always mean closure. In the days following the guilty verdict in David Cam's first trial, a complex mixture of relief and uncertainty washed over the courtroom and the community. For Kimberly's family, the judgment represented accountability. For David's remaining supporters, it was a miscarriage of justice cloaked in circumstantial logic. And for legal professionals watching from a distance, it was a verdict resting on a knife's edge, a case built on blood droplets and conjecture. But the justice system, for all its finality, allows room for second looks. As the appeals process began, attorneys representing Cam dug deep into the foundations of the prosecution's case. Their focus was not only on the blood spatter, though that would remain a key point of contention, but on something even more troubling: the suppression and mishandling of potentially exculpatory evidence. Among the items that had gone virtually unnoticed during the initial investigation was a gray sweatshirt found at the crime scene. It had been logged, bagged, and filed. But critically, it had never been tested for DNA. It carried a logo that read Backbone and a prison-issued Department of Corrections ID number written on the tag. It had not belonged to David Cam. When that sweatshirt was finally subjected to forensic analysis during the post-conviction review process, it yielded a DNA profile. That profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the National DNA Database. The results stunned investigators. The DNA matched a convicted felon named Charles Boney, a man with a long history of violent offenses, particularly crimes against women. He had been released from prison just months before the Cam family murders. Charles Boney's criminal history wasn't just long, it was specific. He had a pattern of accosting women, attempting to dominate or humiliate them, sometimes stealing their shoes. The deviant nature of these offenses had earned him the nickname Shoe Bandit. His connection to the Cam crime scene, even if initially circumstantial, immediately altered the trajectory of the case. When questioned, Boney admitted to being at the Cam residence the night of the murders. But rather than confess to the killings, he offered a disturbing twist. He claimed he had delivered the murder weapon to David Cam and was waiting outside the house when the murders occurred. He framed himself as an unwitting accomplice, caught up in something he didn't understand until it was too late. To prosecutors, this testimony was a gift. It allowed them to explain the presence of the sweatshirt and Boney's DNA while maintaining Cam's guilt. Boney was arrested, charged, and slated to testify as the state's witness in David's second trial. Defense attorneys were stunned, not only by Boney's sudden emergence, but by the state's willingness to accept his story. His credibility was, at best, compromised. His testimony changed multiple times. He offered varying accounts of how he met David, whether or not they had communicated before the crime, and what he claimed to have seen. His final version painted a picture of Cam orchestrating the murders with Boney as the reluctant outsider, manipulated, and ultimately left behind. Despite the shaky narrative, prosecutors pushed forward. In the second trial, which took place in a different county due to intense media coverage, the case once again centered on blood spatter, timeline discrepancies, and now, the testimony of a convicted felon with a direct connection to the crime scene. Boney's presence gave the state a new path to solidify their theory that Cam had not acted alone, but had enlisted the help of someone willing to do what he could not, or at least willing to share the burden. This time, the prosecution leaned harder into character assassination. They reinforced the narrative that David was a controlling, unfaithful husband with a motive to eliminate the people who were threatening his future. They again emphasized the blood evidence on his shirt, now supplemented by Boney's account. The defense countered with aggression. They argued that the presence of another man at the crime scene should have upended the original conviction. They reminded the jury that Boney's history and changing statements made him an unreliable witness, someone who could be cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence or better prison conditions. They brought forward forensic experts who challenged the plausibility of the state's revised narrative. But the damage had been done. For the second time, a jury convicted David Cam of murder. The sentence stood, and once again, David was returned to prison. What the public didn't know, what the press only began to uncover slowly, was that the case was starting to buckle under the weight of its contradictions. Investigators outside the original prosecution team began re-examining the evidence independently. Journalists, legal scholars, and forensic experts took a renewed interest in what was now shaping into one of Indiana's most controversial murder cases. One of those experts was Dr. Robert Shaler, the forensic scientist who had overseen DNA identification in the wake of 9/11s. He reviewed the blood evidence, the scene reconstructions, and the interpretation used by the state's experts. His conclusion was sobering. The blood spatter on David's shirt could not conclusively indicate he was present at the time of the shooting. The evidence had been overstated. Worse, there were signs that some of the forensic analysis may have been influenced by confirmation bias. Another independent reviewer discovered that several key phone records had been misinterpreted, and that the assumed timeline used in the prosecution's case had potentially omitted critical details, such as the exact timestamps of calls and how long it would have actually taken David to leave the basketball game, return home, commit the murders, and make it back without being missed. Even more troubling was a new look at the shoe print. The print found near Kimberly's body matched a model of Nike sneakers that Charles Boney was known to wear. A pair had been found in his possession. The pattern was consistent with his shoes, not with any that belonged to David. This detail had not been thoroughly explored in the earlier trials. Its reintroduction sparked renewed debate about who had truly been inside the garage at the moment of death. The weight of these revelations could not be ignored. Legal advocates filed new appeals. This time, the focus wasn't just on David's potential innocence. It was on whether the state had knowingly pursued a flawed case. The pressure mounted. National media caught on. Television specials were filmed. True crime documentaries began asking questions the courts had avoided for years. Eventually, the Indiana Supreme Court stepped in. After reviewing the evidence, the inconsistencies in Boney's testimony, and the issues surrounding expert witness reliability, the court overturned the second conviction and ordered a third trial. This decision was more than procedural. It was a public acknowledgement that something had gone fundamentally wrong, not just once, but repeatedly. By now, David Cam had spent over a decade behind bars. He had watched the justice system condemn him twice. He had buried his wife and children and endured the disintegration of his personal identity. And yet, for the first time since the garage door opened on that quiet night, the narrative that had defined him, former cop turned family killer, was beginning to fracture. The third trial would be his last, and for the first time, it would be on terms closer to the truth. More than 13 years had passed since the day David Cam stood in his garage, looking at the bodies of his wife and two young children. Over that span, he had been tried twice and convicted twice, enduring more than a decade behind bars, locked away under the weight of a narrative that had refused to shift until now. The third trial would be different. This time, the court allowed a different venue, a new judge, and significantly revised evidentiary standards. This time, the case would no longer hinge on a single stain on a t-shirt, nor would it be driven by a desperate need to resolve a public tragedy. It would be built, or unbuilt, on what had finally come into full light, that the story told in two earlier courtrooms had been based, at best, on partial truths, and at worst, on deliberate distortion. The defense was now armed with a forensic arsenal. Blood spatter experts from multiple institutions, including those with national recognition, testified that the high-velocity droplets once used to implicate Cam could have originated from a number of non-shooting interactions. More importantly, new digital modeling of the garage environment and the vehicle's interior showed that it was highly unlikely, physically implausible, for David to have been positioned to receive the blood spatter in the pattern claimed by the original analysts. But the most significant transformation in this final trial came from a more human element: time. The years had not been kind to the prosecution's story. Charles Boney's testimony, once central to securing David's second conviction, had eroded. He had changed his narrative repeatedly, altering details, shifting blame, contradicting physical evidence. Under cross-examination, his credibility collapsed. Jurors learned that Boney had left DNA not only on the sweatshirt, but also on the door handle of the Cam's vehicle, a detail he had never accounted for in any of his shifting accounts. His fingerprints were found in locations that only the killer could have touched, including inside the vehicle near Jill's booster seat. Prosecutors tried to preserve their version of events, but it became increasingly clear that Boney had far more involvement than he'd admitted, and that the state had, knowingly or not, shaped their case around a man whose motivations were as self-serving as they were unreliable. The prosecution had also lost a powerful emotional weapon: novelty. The horror of the crime, while no less tragic, no longer held the same grip on the jury. This was no longer a fresh wound, it was a reopened one. The jurors of this trial were not being asked to avenge a recent loss. They were being asked to untangle 13 years of institutional error, false assumptions, and scientific overreach. The defense reminded them that justice is not merely about punishment, it is also about precision, about restraint, about recognizing that the presumption of innocence is not a legal formality but a moral foundation. They didn't claim David Cam was a perfect man. They didn't deny his marital issues or ignore the grief his actions had once inspired, but they showed with unshakable clarity that he did not kill his family. The deliberations were not prolonged. After years of legal warfare, the jury returned swiftly, not guilty. David Cam was exonerated on all counts. No cheers erupted in the courtroom. There were no dramatic outbursts, only silence, followed by the slow exhale of a man who had spent over a decade wearing the label of child killer. The relief on his face was tempered by the knowledge that justice delayed is not justice fully delivered. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, but not a whole one. The verdict triggered a wave of public reaction. Some lauded the decision, citing it as a triumph of truth over prosecutorial tunnel vision. Others struggled to accept it. For the family of Kimberly Cam, especially her parents, the exoneration reopened old wounds. They had believed for over a decade that justice had been served. Now, they were being asked to live with a version of the truth they had spent years rejecting. David, meanwhile, filed a civil rights lawsuit against the state of Indiana and the law enforcement officers involved in the investigation, alleging wrongful conviction and malicious prosecution. Depositions from the civil suit unearthed more disturbing details: potential suppression of evidence, failure to follow standard forensic procedures, and an aggressive commitment to a theory that ignored the emergence of Boney as a viable suspect. The case became a landmark example of how prosecutorial momentum can override nuance and how fragile the foundations of guilt can be when built on assumptions. But beyond the legal implications, the human toll was staggering. David had lost his family, not once, but twice. First through violence, then through the years stolen from him while locked in a cell labeled a murderer. The emotional and psychological scars were profound. Even as a free man, he would forever be tethered to the crime. For many in the community, exoneration could not erase the years of headlines. For others, It validated the growing awareness that wrongful convictions are not anomalies, but systemic risks. As for Charles Boney, he was tried and convicted of the murders in a separate proceeding. He received a sentence of 225 years. Unlike David, Boney never faced 3 juries. He never carried the full weight of public suspicion. He slipped through the cracks until science and persistence forced him into the open. In the end, the Cam case is not only about a family torn apart or a man wrongfully imprisoned, it is a case study in the power and peril of narrative, the stories law enforcement constructs, the ones the media amplifies, and the ones juries are asked to believe. It is a reminder that justice is not automatic and truth is not self-evident. Both must be relentlessly pursued, even when the pursuit takes years, and the path winds through error, bias, and loss. David Cam walked out of prison into a world that had forgotten how to see him as anything other than the man in the headlines. He was cleared in the eyes of the law, but exoneration is not absolution. It is the beginning of a reckoning for the system, for those who prosecuted him, and for a society that too often trades nuance for resolution. Justice, in this case, came far too late, but it came, and that matters. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.